Thanks everybody. The last couple of weeks I've been spending most of my time down at Malakuta, and I've also been working on fires of all sorts around Victoria and New South Wales and other places. And I guess each time I come to a community and talk with people, there are some things that are the same sorts of trauma and fear and extreme experiences. But in another way, every fire is unique with its own circumstances and the particular community that's involved and the experiences that people have. And yet, I think we all have the same kind of nervous system and the same kind of makeup. And so what I wanted to talk a bit about is what I've learnt about the kind of state we go into in order to survive a fire and what that sets up for the recovery process. Because the message I want to give is that the recovery process is really not about getting back to where you were before. Because if things are lost, they're lost. And people will often say, after Black Saturday, a lot of the community said, don't talk to us about recovery. We can never go back to what we had. What we really need is another word. So they used words like renewal and so on. Actually, if you look up the word recovery, it starts in Elizabethan times to be used. And it meant then what it means now, to get back to a lost state of health or wealth or happiness. You recover your mood, you recover from a financial loss, you recover from the flu, you get back to where you were. But it's not really the right word for a disaster. Maybe there are some people who can, get insured and get things back the way they were. But for many, many people, it won't be the same. The loss is a loss. It's irreversible. Some people will tell me that I'll never be quite as financially well off. My insurance doesn't quite cover and so on, so I've got to take out another mortgage to rebuild and so on and so forth. So now the important thing is that even though you can't get back to where you were before, there are many different lives we can lead, and we can always seek to ask ourselves, how do I make the value out of the circumstance I've got to actually express what's important to me in my life? How do I actually use the situation I'm in to give myself and my family the best possible life I can? And that's a forward-looking process that actually involves a different set of goals and plans and hopes. And that means you've got to disengage from the goals and plans and hopes that were guiding you before the fire. But in fact, we don't think a great deal about our plans and goals, just about them every now and again when they guide important decisions, and then you forget about them. One day I was driving after Black Saturday up to Bendigo to give a talk to the fire-affected community there. And I live on the other side in the Yarra Valley. And I had to go right round the ring road to get to the Bendigo road. And I'm driving along thinking to myself, now what will I talk about? How long are we after the fire? What will be the issues? What should I be talking about to this community? What do I remember about them last time I visited? And then all of a sudden I'm coming up to the airport turn-off. And I think, hang on a second, where am I going? Am I going to the airport or am I going to Bendigo? What am I going? I'm going to Bendigo. I'm on the wrong side of the freeway. I better get across. And I got across just in time. And then I could forget about going to Bendigo, couldn't I, for the next hour and a half, because I'm just on the freeway and I'm just going up to Bendigo. I only had to remember my goal at that important intersection. And I thought to myself afterwards, isn't that like life? That we have a goal And then maybe we decide to sell a house and buy a new one, and that's where our values come in to guide us as to where we want to live and what kind of a house and so on. And then once we've bought the house, we don't have to think about houses until next time we want to sell, or until it burns down. And then we have to think about it. So that I think there's a really important issue about trying to bring into the foreground of our lives what was important. What made your life meaningful and valuable and rewarding, and to lift that into the foreground and then say, how do I give expression to those qualities in my new circumstances? And that's a creative act, isn't it? You've got to maybe think about things in a different way. And you can't do that when your brain isn't in the right state. And that leads me to talk about the whole business of reacting to the emergency itself. Now, the fundamental idea behind this is what we call arousal. Arousal is the energising and activation of our body, brain, mind, emotions to deal with a threat or a challenge. And I want to talk about that a bit because probably you're only just starting to come out of it. People are different, but see, when the fire comes, everyone goes into emergency mode, I call it. The chemical that animates us I'm oversimplifying it, this is Rob Gordon's fairy tale about the physiology of stress, but we just need a fairy tale to guide us. So adrenaline kicks in with a whole lot of other stuff, and what adrenaline does is floods our system with reserves of energy that we've got stashed away in various places in our body. Just floods them into mainly the muscles. Our brain fires up so that the right side of our brain is working, where we think in pictures. Because thinking in pictures and actions is what is going to help us survive a physical threat, and that's what triggers the adrenaline. I remember in that trip to Bendigo talking to a woman who said, I knew there was a fire and I went to the back door and there was my fence, just about from here to there, she said, and it burst into flames in front of my eyes. And I said, what did you think? She said, I didn't think, I was just in the moment. So her thinking is completely suspended and everything is, what do I need to do? Everything is attuned to this action. So that the pure adrenaline state is a state of action. Now, there's a problem. If you're dealing with something you've never dealt with before and you don't have any previously practiced skills, you don't know what to do. So what people typically do is dither. They run around and they'll say they're panicking. They're not. They're dithering. They just don't know what to do. Can't think clearly because you can't get into the part of your brain on the left side where you actually start to think strategically and problem solve and analyse. If you've been in the fire brigade and you've been practiced and you know a whole lot of things, you just go straight into those things without thinking. They just emerge from you don't know where. It could have been 20 years ago and suddenly it's all there. That's what the adrenaline does. Any skills you've got will suddenly emerge until you reach a situation which you can't deal with, and then you dither. And then you get into this sort of... And that's a very disturbing experience, that dithering, because you have a sense of losing control. But it's because of the fact that your brain is in this highly specialised state. Now, I've, over the last few years, been reading some research on adrenaline, and psychologists who've got nothing better to do than do experiments on their undergraduate students have put them in laboratories and giving them injections of adrenaline and tried to get them to do various puzzles and problems. And what they find is adrenaline produces two basic effects. One is a narrowing and focusing of attention onto what you think is the important attribute of the environment. So onto the threat, onto the thing. So if you've got a bull charging, you're only looking at his horns, right? You just zero in the horns. What do I have to do to avoid those horns or the fire or whatever it might be? And you're not going to worry about the periphery. Now, there's an advantage in that because you're just focused on the problem, but there's a disadvantage because your decision-making might not be that good because you're not taking the whole situation into account. And so if you stay in that situation, you're just focused on, you're looking for the next little bit. We find that that's very characteristic of people in the weeks afterwards, when they will say, I don't have this information, or how come there isn't this service available, or whatever, because they've come into the recovery centre in adrenaline mode of saying, I just want this. In fact, it was the other day I was told people were trying to give assistance and money to people, and they were saying, I don't need money, I just need water for my stock. You know, because they're in adrenaline mode, the problem is the stock and the water. And people are trying to actually fill out grants and give them money, and they can't take it in. It doesn't fit into my narrow slit of information. And so people often are very mystified. I remember once there was a fire in the Dandenongs behind Melbourne, and after about 6 weeks, the minister came up, and you know what politicians are like, they give speeches, and he congratulated the recovery system, and this bloke yelled out, I don't know what you mean about your bloody recovery system, I haven't seen anyone. And the minister was, of course, aghast. Now, the coordinator was standing beside him, and she sort of rushed off to the records and found he'd had 2 visits and 4 telephone contacts. So every week he'd been contacted. But of course, he's not taking in the verbal information that the person contacting him represents the recovery system. He's saying, I want this, or I need this, or what's happening about that. He's actually not looking at the context. Who is this person? How come they're actually knocking on my door? What do they represent? He's just got these fragments. And so he doesn't have a sense of the whole system, which is, of course, demoralising, isn't it? He feels he's in a chaotic environment that doesn't make sense. And I think that's what we all feel when we're suddenly in this high arousal state in a system that's unfamiliar to us. And there's just 1 or 2 other things about adrenaline. You can see people are in adrenaline mode when they have that highly alert, focused and unexpressive face. No emotion. Just totally like this. And what that shows, if you think about it, is that they've put aside all of the energy that might express it as emotion and retract it into action. There's a great advantage in that, isn't it? As long as you can keep acting in order to pursue the problem of dealing with the threat. So you think of it this way, the adrenaline is releasing a huge amount of energy, your brain's in this narrow focus, and there's the problem, and that's an ideal mix, provided you've got some skills. And then suddenly something gets in the way, you can't do it. And you would have all experienced this. You've got a plan and it's blocked. Now, can you think, there's a story about a bloke who stayed to defend his house in Black Saturday in Kinglake. His family went away, you know, agile, fit young man, and he couldn't control it. He actually thought, I'm going to die. He runs down through the burning paddock towards the dam, and he hits the fence. And he hits the fence and collapses. And he thinks, I'm going to die. It's burning all around him. And the mobile phone rings. Now, as long as we've got 2 brain cells, we're going to answer the phone, aren't we? It's an automatic. So he answers the phone. It's his boss. How are you going with the fire, Bill? Now, I can't remember how he said it, but I'm lying on the ground beside the fence dying, he says, in whatever language he would have said it. And what does his boss say, do you reckon? Get through the bloody fence and go to the dam, you idiot. Now, that was enough to prompt him because he hit the fence. Now, normally if you're wandering around your property, you don't climb through fences, you go through gates, don't you? A fence is a block. So he hits the block, he can't think through what to do about it. And he needs to be prompted, climb through the fence. And he does climb through the fence. He's quite badly burnt, but he makes it to the dam and survives. So, you know, it's something about the rigidity of our our functioning when we're in that high adrenaline mode. It's very specific, and it might do the right thing or it might not. And the thing I want to emphasise is that when you can't do what you've set yourself to do, that energy cannot discharge out of the system as purposeful action. And what we see then is that it's blocked and it's going to feed back into the system. What will happen to it then? We can't just keep on building up the energy. It's got to escape somehow. So it escapes by emotion. That's the alternative way of the energy spilling out. And it's going to escape as one of two emotions, because they're the primitive emotions: anxiety or anger. Anxiety is going to make us feel disorganised and frightened. I don't know what to do. I feel helpless and overwhelmed and weak. And anger is, I'm going to focus. If I can't do this, I'm going to focus on it. It must be Alex's fault. He's the problem. I'll go and yell at him for about half an hour. That'll make me feel a lot better. Except it isn't really Alex's fault, and that doesn't get us. So what we actually can say is that if there's a lot of adrenaline going around, and you've been in adrenaline for some time, I don't know how long, but usually in fires, they grumble around for a while and you have an extended period of fighting the fire, and that adrenaline is kicked up and your whole system has gone into that mode. And I can tell you that working with, in my clinical work, I've worked sometimes with people who've had a traumatic incident, a nice tidy one, where like a criminal event or whatever. And if you work with that person, they will actually take a few weeks before they really come right out of it. And now in a bushfire, it's confused because everybody's in adrenaline, the community's disorganised, there's a whole lot of things that are very unusual, whereas in a car accident or a criminal event, everyone around is still in their normal state. But if it takes 3 or 4 weeks for that one-off short incident to actually settle, well, we should actually try and keep an eye on each other and ourselves and say, am I out of this yet? Because as long as you're in that state, you're generating a lot of energy which you may not be able to use effectively, and then it's going to spill into emotion. So you get this environment after disasters of high emotionality, which easily spills into anger, blame and discord, whether it be in the community or in the families or whatever. I think it's a really important thing to try and depersonalise it. So if I'm yelling at Alex for half an hour, Alex can just simply say to himself, well, poor old Rob's in high arousal, isn't he? And be nice to me, that'll probably settle it down. But if he starts yelling back, what do you think I'm trying to do? I'm working my fingers, we're actually not going to get on too well. And that's what's happening. So I think to really understand this dynamic of adrenaline, there's another thing about adrenaline. Have you ever been in adrenaline mode and someone comes up to you and says, geez, you look terrible. How are you feeling? And well, what you're going to do is politely say, look, excuse me, would you go away? I've got a lot of work to do. You're getting in the way. Because my focus in adrenaline is on the problem. And if you start talking about me, you're absolutely going in the wrong direction, because I'm trying to fix the problem. Even if it's not possible, I'm trying to fix it. And if you're trying to focus on me, then you're going to actually be a nuisance. You'll be another problem. Because what adrenaline does is shut down the feedback system. That's what that blank face means. Normally, the facial muscles are a constant signalling about my state of mind and my emotions, how I feel about you and the world and everything else. But that adrenaline mode, I don't have any expression at all except activity. And physiologically, we know that when the adrenaline response kicks in, it produces endorphins, which bond to pain receptors and shut them down. You would notice that you don't feel pain in a sporting competition or something like that. And so, people after Black Saturday would say, I remember a bloke who's about my age who fought Black Saturday on his property. He said, it's strange, I just didn't feel tired, I didn't feel hunger, I didn't feel thirst, I didn't feel pain, I didn't feel anything. I didn't even feel the heat, he said, because the feedback system is completely shut down. Now, what do we use the feedback system for? To tell us how we're going, right? Now, I'm not going to consider myself, it's a great advantage to not consider yourself and put all the focus out onto the world. But it's dangerous because now I'm in a state where I'm not actually making any decisions about myself. Therefore, there's only one thing's going to happen. I'm going to work until I drop. And when I drop, I'm completely exhausted and I'm not going to rebound very well. And I think that's a very important thing to understand because in the adrenaline mode, I feel, to begin with, heroic and strong and determined and all the rest of it. But it's a dangerous state because I'm not taking care of myself. And I think it's very important that people understand the need to actually look after themselves from their knowledge, not from the feedback loop. But under normal circumstances, you know, we eat when we're hungry, we rest when we're tired, and so on. It's not going to work like that in adrenaline mode. And if you're still in adrenaline mode, you probably have a lot of trouble relaxing. You don't sleep. You can't just sit quietly under a tree on a Sunday afternoon. You've got to rush around and do stuff. The thing you've got to ask is, am I productive? And you probably aren't. I don't know, I'm just talking about myself. But, you know, you're active without being productive. And so the important thing is, I think, to replace feedback with understanding of ourselves. And when I try to think of an analogy, I say, we actually have routines of hygiene that are not based on feedback. So we don't only wash our hands when they feel dirty, do we? We wash them when we know they may have been contaminated by some bacteria or other. And so we've got a whole lot of hygiene procedures that wouldn't make sense to anyone in, I don't know, 300 years ago. You have a bath every day? My God, why would you waste so much water and time? We have it once a month if we need it, you know? But no, we actually got a whole lot of procedures that are based on hygiene understanding. So we've got to actually look after ourselves from our understanding while we're in high arousal, or we actually run a big risk. Now, why does it take so long to actually come down? Well, one of the reasons is the trauma response. I want to talk about basically the three main problems that I see after disasters. The first is trauma, which is the word trauma means wound. Right? Trauma medicine is medical care of people who've been run over by buses rather than had heart attacks. They've been damaged and wounded. So the psychological trauma is, I can't process what happened, it keeps coming back to me. I don't feel as though it's finished. Every time I smell the smoke of a barbecue, I suddenly feel as though there's a bushfire. The second problem is loss, whatever we've lost. And the losses are most complicated and often highly personal, in addition to the obvious ones of losing your house or your other parts of your property. People lose their sense of community, they lose nature, they lose all sorts of things. And the response to loss is grief. And grief is hard work. I want to speak about that in a minute. But the third one took me the longest to understand. And that's simply disruption. And that can go on until your life is back in order, proceeding towards the new creative goals that you've worked out for yourself. Until then, until you're back in routine, your life is disrupted. I just want to speak briefly about each of these three because I think the earlier we recognise them and get onto them, the better. So I've mentioned how our brain is fired up in adrenaline to process information. In adrenaline mode, we process information incredibly quickly and we'll often just do things without thinking, just the perfect thing, and we wonder, how did I learn to do that? When I've worked that out with people who've been in a very dangerous situation, they've done exactly the thing or said the thing which just defused it. If you actually say, let's talk about all the skills you've learned doing this work and all the different experiences you've had, what you find out is they have a whole lot of skills that are packed away that they didn't realise they had. And in that adrenaline mode, we have an ability to short circuit and go straight to the essence of the situation. If we don't dither, that'll often be very, very effective. But in the same way, whatever we experience is sinking deep into the core of our brain, into what I think of as our reptile brain. We have these very primitive parts of our brain that fire up and sort of come into the foreground. And do you ever have that experience where you're actually doing something incredibly dangerous and difficult, and there's a little part of you saying, this is a bit dangerous, I should be careful here, or something. So I can give you an example. After Black Saturday, well, before Black Saturday, I had my fire hose uncoiled in the grass, and it's about that round, black textured, and luckily the fire didn't go over our place. The wind changed, unluckily for other people, but it was just lying there a few weeks later. Now, at that stage, before they subdivided the river flats, we used to get copperhead snakes in our garden every year. They're little blokes with just little heads, and they're coppery coloured. And you only have to meet a couple when you're walking around the place, and your reptile brain is, as soon as you walk outside, is looking for them. So I go up the back, and I'm walking back down, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a length of this textured black hose from between two tufts of grass. And my reptile brain it doesn't speak English, but if I were to translate it, would be shrieking at me, "Oh my God, look at that snake, it's a black one, look how big it is, it's disappearing off into the, huge, great big..." And at the same time I feel this, it's my cortex, my human brain clicking in and saying, "Calm down, Rob, it's the fire hose." Have you ever been in that experience? Now then you're actually seeing these two systems at work in your brain. The human brain, which has got language and thought and understanding and memory, and the reptile brain that's just in reaction mode. Now that's what comes into the foreground in the adrenaline, and that's what we work out of. Now that's going to imprint deep into your brain all the information that needs to be dealt with, which is the threat information. And so the most important post-traumatic reaction is that I can't stop the memories or the images, including the smell and so on, coming back and back and back. Now, if you talk to people or you let them talk to you about their experience, what I notice is, assuming that the worst thing hasn't happened, that is, they nearly died or they thought they were in big trouble but they didn't get burnt. If the worst does happen and you do get physically injured or whatever, it's a bit more complicated. But for most people, luckily, they have what we could call a near miss. I mean, the house might burn down, but you have actually escaped with your life. That's the important thing. And what people will say as they describe these experiences, they will tell a story and it'll escalate to a point of the greatest threat, and they'll almost invariably interrupt the story and leave the narrative and go off into some other emotional consequence of that. Like I heard this story of this young man down in Malakuta who was behind his house, and there was a bit of a gap between him and the forest, and he was out there and he was going to fight the fire, and then suddenly this fire erupted out of the forest, and he was completely unprepared for it, and he thought, "I'm going to die." Right? And then he would say, I'm just making it up now, I can't get over it, I don't feel the same, I have nightmares all the time, why wasn't the CFA there, they should have burnt the forest, we should have had more. He's no longer telling the story, is he? He's gone off into the emotional consequences of that moment of encounter. And now, what are you curious about from my story? I shouldn't do this, I keep asking audiences questions. But aren't you curious about how come he didn't die? Yeah. Now, I call this the ad break. You know, on TV, where they stop at the most exciting point and so you watch a McDonald's ad? It's the ad break. So what it's showing is that the memories that they've described to you, which are so vivid, are not really human processed knowledge memories. That I had a frightening experience a year ago, and at the time I was very frightened. No, it's re-experiencing. It's I'm having it again. All of the nerve cells and so on that process that actual experience are reactivated, and we know now about the circuits and everything. So every time something, because when you're in that state, you learn like a dog by association. You know, in fact, if you go up to the Daintree, they hang these lumps of pork out the side of the boat for the crocodiles, and they train the crocodiles to leap up so that the tourists get a big photograph. That's the reptile brain, crocodiles and sharks. You know, they're very effective, but in a very simple way. They also say they've all got personalities, and they'll tell you all the personalities of these different crocodiles. So there are lots of deep structures in our brain. So what's happening then is that in this moment, the reptile brain has got these fragments. Now, the reptile brain is active when we're under high threat. The moment where actually the threat is subsiding and we think, oh, I'm not going to die after all, or somebody's come to help me, that's actually bringing the arousal down, isn't it? And that doesn't go into the reptile brain, that comes into the human brain. It's like we've got two circuits, a high arousal circuit where all the danger information is, and a low arousal circuit where all the reassuring information is. And we then oscillate between them. And when we're in I should turn it upside down because the high arousal circuit's in the reptile brain and the low arousal circuit's in the human brain. I'm getting complicated. The brain is very complicated, but we'll oscillate. You know, sometimes we'll feel okay and say, thanks very much for coming and rescuing me, and then I'm waking up with nightmares. Now, I think something we can all do for ourselves and for each other is to try and bring the connection between the disconnected fragments. And you'll hear the disconnected fragments if you stay with the story and don't get sidetracked by the emotions. So when they start telling you it's all Alex's fault, what you need to say is just this very simple question. When you get to the ad break, let them talk about the emotions they have, and then bring them back and say, what happened next? Or, how come you didn't die? It's a pretty blunt question, isn't it? But that's the thing they have to hold on to, because every time they remember they nearly died, they need to remember why they didn't, because that will actually keep bringing them out. When the memory sequence will go up into the danger and then out how they actually got out, instead of going up into the danger and then round and round and round. That's what forms the post-traumatic image. And the longer we go around that loop, the more that becomes ingrained. Because post-traumatic stress can't be diagnosed until a month after the event because it's not a disorder. Right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a disorder because everyone has those reactions to begin with. But most people settle them down, but for some people they don't settle, they keep going. And that's where we need to get onto that and find out why that recovery is not happening. We know that if people talk together about what happened, that a lot of sorting out gets done. That the focus on the events is the key point. And going into the emotions often complicates it, and people often feel vulnerable. They don't want to talk about the very personal aspects of it to begin with. They've got to get the framework. We know there's a fellow in America who's done research where he's actually got people after disasters to keep journals. So they're just talking to themselves. It's the putting into words of the experiences that is so tremendously important and beneficial. And the moment we talk, we have to move the images that are sitting there in the right side of our brain into the left side to find the words. So one thing you can do with each other is just be interested in the experience. Just try to make sense of it. And if you can't get the whole story, ask for what's missing. Because what we know is that, to begin with, in high arousal, you just have a series of incredibly disconnected fragments that go around like a salad, creating emotions. And so the conversation in social events or whatever is incredibly important. And if it's not settling, that's probably when it's really beneficial to sit down with someone with a bit of training who can work out why it's not subsiding. So we normally see that subsides, but what really is part of the fracturing is the assumptions I have about nature, the world, fires, summertime, the Adelaide Hills are shattered. You didn't realise you had assumptions, because assumptions are assumed. What assumptions do you have about sitting here this evening and listening to me? Well, if I leapt on the table and started singing songs, and then later on Red Cross said, we've got this very interesting psychologist from Melbourne coming to talk, would you like to come? You say, no, he's out of tune. I'm not interested. Because I would shatter your assumption. You don't realise you've got an assumption that this should be useful. Did anyone consider whether, in fact, this is an earthquake-proofed building?
No, because we don't live in an earthquake area.
Any part of Australia, I'm pleased to tell you, is vulnerable to an earthquake. When I lived in Adelaide, and I was about 4, there was an earthquake. Not a really big one, but that's the assumption, isn't it? I don't need to worry about earthquakes. If there was one, you'd be very surprised, wouldn't you? And you probably wouldn't want to come to the hall for a while if the roof fell in, and it took about 3 days to dig you out. Sorry, I don't want to upset you all. But what I'm trying to illustrate is we don't know what our assumptions are because they're assumed. Now, part of the recovery, or part of trauma, is the assumptions are damaged. So we have to rebuild them. What assumptions? What it's like in the summertime in the Adelaide Hills. Can you see that you'll have to go through a few summers rebuilding your assumptions that, yes, we do have very bad fires here, but not every year, I hope. Right? Or we do have very bad fires, but the weather's not right, or the vegetation's not right, or whatever, it's going to be all right. That'll be using that human. And we slowly build up assumptions that include fire, but not every time. Not every time there's a barbecue. Whereas before, we had assumptions that didn't include fire. So when there's a fire, suddenly everything becomes fire-centric. Look, I can tell you from Black Saturday, my house didn't get burnt, but it was pretty disturbing to be, and you would know, on a summer's afternoon at 5 o'clock and it's as black as at night for about half an hour. And you can't see basically your hand in front of your face. And the closer the fire gets, the less you know what the hell's going on, right? All that sort of experience. But there was a very powerful north wind at the time, and even in the winter for quite some time, when there's a bit of mist and drizzle on the rain, when that wind was tossing the trees on the boundary around, my wife and I would just say, we don't like this, we feel very uneasy. It couldn't possibly be a fire, but that wind becomes a signal for agitation. So you've got to, I found probably 2 or 3 years later, 2 or 3 years ago, that's probably after about 6 or 7 years, I wasn't having it anymore because I'd had enough north winds with nothing bad happening to rebuild my assumptions. Can you see? So that there's no way of shortcutting the rebuilding of assumptions, but you've got to work on it to actually hold what there is to learn from the fire without being traumatically oversensitive. And that means thinking about it, understanding how fire works and so on. So therefore, it's going to take a few summers to rebuild those assumptions. And so we need to understand that the recovery period is a few years, at least psychologically. And what's important is, I think the motto of my message is, we do not start recovery until we get out of arousal. Because until we get out of arousal, we don't start to be able to think with our creative human part of our mind. Think about new goals, process the whole experience, put that story together in words, have a conversation that allows it to sort of say, well, it's 6 months and 12 months and so on. I'm sorry to say that it's going to take a few years, but I think it's really important that people understand, and we have a community that goes through this process together. Now, I want to say a couple of words about grief, because there are all sorts of things we can grieve for after a disaster. And you know, we all know what grief feels like. It's a very heavy, powerless state. And a lot of the pain is because we haven't accepted into our deeper assumptions that something we valued is not there anymore. You know, so, and I've worked with people who've lost loved ones, and, you know, it's very acute all the time for a while, and then later on, I remember a woman saying she'd accepted it, she thought, and then she found that she would be looking to the door about the time her husband would have normally come home, and she'd feel a sort of a kind of waiting, and then realise he's not coming, and then the sadness comes in, and so you get this rhythm with grief between a sort of not wanting the loss to be there and then colliding with the loss. It's painful, and we know that pain is an inevitable part of actually getting our whole deeper parts of our being to accept. And so people who've been through grief will say what helps them out of it, out the other side, is acceptance. It's the hardest thing. It takes time. And there are all sorts of things that people are going to have to accept. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of energy, a lot of emotional energy. And everyone's going to do it in their own time, in their own way. And in fact, we often don't know what people's grief is going to be about. In fact, sometimes people don't even know themselves. They have to really talk about it for some time and work out. I remember talking to a man who had a farm in the Lockyer Valley, and he just felt so sad and depressed. He said, the only thing I ever wanted was to have a farm. And he worked in town and eventually got enough money to buy this farm, and it was absolute pride and joy. And then the flood came and completely demolished it. And he felt ashamed of the farm. He didn't want his wife and kids to come because it had somehow been ruined. And he would describe, see, it's a slightly different sort of arousal, but he would describe a state where he couldn't get anything done. He'd drag himself out of bed in the morning, he'd go over to his tractor and he'd start setting it up to do something, and then he needed a spanner and he'd go over to the workshop, and there on the workshop would be a pump he'd been tinkering with, and he'd get sidetracked onto the pump, and then he needed another tool, and he'd go, and by the end of the day he'd just moved from one thing to another and hadn't got anything done, and he'd feel demoralised and he'd feel sad again. And you know, we had to have several conversations to track it down. And what he eventually realised was that his neighbour had come to him after the flood and said, do you mind if I put a bit of an embankment around my house to protect it from a flood in the future? No go for your life, he said. You know, there's a whole lot of thing about embankments. You know, there are regulations about it and so on. So he went home for the weekend, or went to join his wife for the weekend. When he came back, this bloke had got a whole lot of his mates and they'd put an embankment down the entire boundary along the creek, which meant he would now forever after get all of the water on his property. That's really what had completely demoralised him, but he couldn't actually put it all together because he needed to stop and talk and reflect, and that's what made him feel my farm is ruined. But once he identified that, I remember ringing him the next time, a couple of weeks later, and he said, actually, I'm feeling a bit better. I've been able to get the tractor out and do a bit of ploughing and do this, that and the other, and I'm starting to actually get the whole thing. It's like, okay, it's nothing he can do. He'd actually rang all the authorities and no one was interested in doing it. So actually he got to accept it. And he was now getting back to the love of his life, which, in addition to his wife, of course, was his farm, and starting to get some positive experiences. But he needed to track that through, so that there are a lot of aspects of loss that can be confusing. There's nothing like an opportunity just to talk through and share with people, which leads me to listening. You know, we don't talk unless someone listens to us, do we? And people who've been through disasters find in a remarkably short time their friends and relatives that are outside the area who haven't been affected start to get restless and impatient when you want to talk about it. And people who've been through it need to talk about it an awful lot because they've got a lot of processing to do. And so the friends and relatives sort of feel, you know, don't be negative, look on the bright side, you should pull yourself together, you should move on, you should do something positive. You know, that well-meaning advice that often works well for things that aren't as big. And so what happens? You don't talk to them because they don't get it. And so there's a tendency for people to become isolated. And that's where I think the building of a recovery community amongst those affected is absolutely essential, so that you can talk to each other. And I think just listening draws the words out, doesn't it? Lets us share. So we don't have to solve the problems. I think that's the hardest thing to get. We don't have to solve the problems, we just have to share them. And that makes the person feel better. If you try and solve it, they're not ready for solving it, or they've tried it all already, or whatever. You just actually, it's like someone whose foot is tied to the floor and they've got water dripping on their head, and you go over and say, you know, you must be very unhappy and miserable here, why don't you come over here? It's much more, and the person's saying, I can't move. No, I'm sure it'll be much better if you know, because if you're sad, you're sad. And it's so helpful to have somebody who just is with you. Now, I think grief is expensive. It's expensive in energy. It takes a huge amount of energy because an enormous amount of processing is going on deep down. And I think we've got to really protect ourselves and ensure that we are nurturing for this demand of energy. If you're going to run a marathon, you'd do a lot to prepare yourself, wouldn't it? You look after yourself. Well, we need to do that as we go into this. And I'm really just talking about grief in a very simple way, but there are a lot of complex problems. And that takes me to how do we create an environment where we can get that energy? Well, I want to come back to the question of what did you do before the fire in a routine way that gave your life meaning and value, because meaning and value and enjoyment and purpose are really what give us energy, don't they? If you do something and think that was really worthwhile, I feel great. Even if I feel exhausted, I feel great in another way. Now, once you get into the post-disaster turmoil, all of the demands, the multiple issues you've got to deal with, actually usually involve a loss of the order of your life before. You may be in temporary accommodation and so on. And what I've learned is during that period where there is a disorganised lifestyle, and I was talking to some people earlier today and I was saying to somebody outside the fire environment, I was saying, a way to think about it is if you were to go home tonight and you find a tree has fallen on your bathroom and trashed it, and you now have to go through a whole lot of process with insurance and builders and so on to replace your bathroom, have you got space in your life to do it, or is your life already full up? People's lives are already full, aren't they? So how are you going to fit in all the demand and time to do that? What are you going to drop out? You're going to drop something out, aren't you? So what we're going to drop out is what appears to be unimportant. We'll stop enjoying ourselves, we'll stop going out, we'll stop, our social lives, we'll do away with everything that isn't advancing what appears to be the important problem. And that's the disruption that goes on, and it will happen with people who are volunteering in the community as well. So we have to make decisions about what we're going to drop out. And if we're in adrenaline mode and not using feedback and not thinking about things, we're going to drop out everything that is not focused on the big problem. But the big problem is not a recipe for the future, is it? I remember in St Andrews in the Yarra Valley, an elderly couple who'd been several times to my talks, and it was probably the last talk I gave there in the 4th year, came up to me and said, now when we look back, we didn't have much money and we've rebuilt, but we look around now at the house we've rebuilt and we see all sorts of possibilities we would have had with the same amount of money to build a much nicer house that we enjoyed living in, was creative and so on, but we couldn't think about it at the time. We just did the simple, bare bones of a house. And he said, now, listening to you, I realise we actually rebuilt too early because they couldn't get themselves into that creative frame of mind where they say, no, he said, we'll never be able to buy another house. We're retired. This is the house we'll live in for the rest of our lives. But you've got to get into a frame of mind where you say, hey, what will I have? And that means I think it's very important to manage your mind and get into that right state. And the best way of managing your mind is to actually bring order and structure in your life and reactivate those things that gave you a sense of control and purpose and direction and enjoyment and value for your life. To put energy into that. And when you feel overwhelmed and unable to deal with things, just say to yourself, my brain's not right, I need to get my brain right, and then go back to the problem. The chemistry of this longer term stress is not so much adrenaline, because that's all over, you burn out very quickly. It's endurance mode. And to oversimplify it, I call it cortisol mode. Cortisol conserves and helps us endure. But in cortisol mode, we can do anything that is automatic, routine and familiar. But we can't think creatively. Just think about it. Have you ever been highly stressed and someone says, can I do anything to help you? And then, damn it, they're so stupid, you've got to explain everything to them, and then they've got their own ideas about how it could be done, and in the end you say, look, leave it alone, I'll do it myself. The cortisol mode means we become more and more active and achieve less and less. I can tell everyone who recognises this state. I'm an authority in it because people try to tell me I should run my practice. But you see, what you're not able to do is step back and make strategic, problem-solving, lateral thinking, creative solutions. We've got to get ourselves out of cortisol mode. A colleague of mine used to run a support group in the Yarra Valley after Black Saturday. And at a certain point, they were really struggling, people, and they'd come along and they'd say, oh, I've had a terrible month. I've been in the corduroy zone. And they'd say, oh, the corduroy zone isn't that terrible. I was in the corduroy zone last month, What are you doing to look after yourself? And she couldn't work out where this came from. And eventually somebody said something. She realised it was sort of a garbled translation of the talks I gave in the area on the cortisol zone. They had a language to actually understand, not that life is hopeless and overwhelming and I wonder what the point of it all is and I'm, going into depression. But hang on, I'm in the corduroy zone. I've got to actually get out of it. And how do I get out of it? Pleasure and leisure. That's all. If you just follow that, every week, a certain amount of pleasure and leisure. Every day, a certain amount of pleasure. I haven't got time for that, I've got to rebuild a house. No, you can't afford not to, because otherwise the rest of life deteriorates. And we know that if you stay in that cortisol too long, you are vulnerable to a whole serious lot of physical and mental conditions. So therefore, my motto is, I reckon you're probably just starting to come out of the adrenaline mode. That means you may well notice a lot of these experiences starting to sort of pop and rumble around in your mind. It means that you're starting to reflect. This is a time to start talking about it, knitting it together and doing that work. Maybe keep a journal, paint pictures, whatever suits you, write poetry. All the artists are very helpful here. We've to form a story about our experience that becomes history in the past. And as you move in, if you've got a long, hard slog ahead, really think about how you will protect the things you don't want to lose. Your health, your relationship with your kids, your career, your social connections, and really rebuild as you can, replace as you can, while you protect what you can't replace. And we know that if people do that together, they help each other. When one person's in corduroy zone, somebody else isn't. I'll just finish with this one point. There's an American academic who's had exactly the right preparation for doing disaster research. He was a professor of political science and took a job in New Orleans a couple of weeks before the flood, the hurricane, Katrina. And he lost everything. He didn't know about disasters, so he didn't even take his computer when he evacuated. He lost absolutely everything. Now, what he's done is he's shown that the most reliable index that predicts the best recovery, the fastest recovery and the most complete recovery in terms of the number of people that return is social networks and community life and working together and creating mutual self-help groups. And he's even done a whole lot of research in Japan, and he says after the tsunami there, and there's a whole lot of communities that were hit by the tsunami, so he can compare them all. And what predicts the death rate is not the amount of money they spend on seawalls. Seawalls were all picked up and rammed into the towns behind, but the social networking indexes, the number of people that come out and vote, the number of mutual aid societies, the number of support systems that were there, because those people told their neighbours there was a tsunami, whereas the other people who relied on the seawall didn't bother about it. Very simple. And if you want to take the index of how many people return and how quickly does the town get going, it's the towns with the good social networks that get going well before the other ones. And so we've got to get this clear message that what really counts is the community life and the social world, he calls it social capital. The amount of energy we put into social relationships and mutual help, which means we've got to get beyond the little differences. I don't know whether you've had, people saying, well, so-and-so got money and they shouldn't have deserved it, or they've had, been taking too much from their material aid. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's their problem. Just try and nurture the community, because that's what will take you all through it together. We've now got, I've seen when I first went to Macedon after Ash Wednesday, I was told you're there for 6 months and you're only to see disaster-related problems, not anything else. There's no such thing. Everyone have got problems before the disaster, don't they? So it all gets tangled up. You just need to go in and help people. And then we said, we've been there for 6 months, we think we should stay there a bit longer and a bit longer and a bit longer. We ended up spending 4 years in the community. And so we now have got the policies that say, a 3-year time frame as a sort of start. It's been wonderful to see this time frame that actually reflects the real human task. So, I'm sure you'll have a lot of help and support around here, and if you can hold together this community life, I'm sure you'll do it very well together. So look, I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions or thoughts. Maybe we've been videoing that, but maybe, I don't know whether we turn it off for the questions.
Yeah.